My Lord, ladies and gentlemen, it's not often you can say my Lord, but in deference to the presence of Lord Turnberg, I'm able to say that. I've not been introduced before by two people. I don't know what they said about me, but I hope it wasn't too bad. What a fantastic venue. Would you not rather be watching a film than listening to me speak? I'm actually going to take advantage of that to make a small commercial. I've just finished making a film, actually a documentary film, which I was presenting, which the cameraman, the photographer for the film was an extremely talented young Dutchman called Leonard Ferret. I'm not sure that's the correct pronunciation, but it's something like that. And it's called Whose Land? It's about the legal and historic rights of Israel to its land. And it's available, I think, in Amazon, and certainly if you Google Whose Land, ? You can probably download it online, I suspect. So that out of the way, it's a real pleasure to be here. And I'm very grateful to CIDI for inviting me to take part in this extremely important event. And also I want to pay tribute to CIDI for the extremely valuable work that they do, along with other similar Israel supporting organizations in Europe and elsewhere in the West. I think it's extremely valuable to ensure that the truth gets out there, as well as a great deal of the fiction and propaganda that we all get subjected to. The Balfour Declaration. As a Brit, I'm extremely proud to come from the country that is responsible for the Balfour Declaration. And I think there's little question that the Balfour Declaration was a fundamentally important event in the creation of the modern-day state of Israel. And in fact, the Knesset speaker Yuri Edelstein said at a Knesset event to commemorate the Balfour Declaration, I think it was yesterday or the day before, he said, "We know that without that declaration, we would not be standing here today in the Knesset building in an independent state," which I think really confirms from the horse's mouth almost the significance of that event. The Balfour Declaration, however, would have meant nothing, in my opinion, if it hadn't been for the blood sacrifice of British Empire forces who were fighting to remove the Turks, the Ottoman Empire, from the land of Palestine, particularly in 1917 and 1918. And I speak as a soldier whose regiment fought in a number of battles in Palestine over that period. The 554,828 British Empire troops became casualties during that fighting. And of that huge number, 16,000 were killed in action, fighting to rid Palestine of the Ottoman Empire. And among those, actually, among those soldiers, commanded by General Allenby, a great general, was the Jewish Legion. And the Jewish Legion was founded 100 years ago as well. It was founded in 1917, and it played a major role in the fighting in 1918 to throw the Turks out. So we've got both the Balfour Declaration and the creation of the Jewish Legion in 1917, 100 years ago. And incidentally, the Jewish Legion, when it was created in 1917, was the first formed Jewish fighting force since the Maccabees, an incredible achievement, made up of British, American, and Russian and Jews from Palestine as well. And they went out and fought under a British Christian lieutenant colonel called Jonathan Patterson, who, after the war, went over to the United States of America, got to know the father of the current Prime Minister of Israel, and the father, Benzion Netanyahu, became so close to Colonel Jonathan Patterson that he named his oldest son after him, Jonathan, Yoni, who of course was the hero of Entebbe. And Colonel Patterson's dying wish almost was to be buried among his men in the land of Palestine, among his men that had been killed there. And because it was 1947 when he died, he wasn't able to be buried there then, but about 2 years ago, his remains were taken from the United States where they were buried and reinterred in a military graveyard in just north of Netanya in Israel among Jewish soldiers, and the ceremony was presided over by the Prime Minister. But if it hadn't been for the actions of the Jewish Legion and the other British soldiers, then I think it's highly likely we would not have the state of Israel today. The Balfour Declarations stated an intention, but the fighting enabled it to happen. Because if we hadn't removed the Turks from Palestine then, when would they have been removed? There's every possibility they could have still been there today and no state of Israel. And by the way, for those of you who aren't aware, the poppy I'm wearing in my lapel, we wear it in England between the 1st and around the 12th of November each year to commemorate British soldiers who have been killed in action, including the ones that were killed fighting in Palestine in 1917 and 1918. I said I'm proud as a Brit to come from the country that was responsible for the Balfour Declaration. Of course, it wasn't just Britain that brought about the Balfour Declaration. It wasn't a unilateral statement, although it's often seen that way. It was done also with the strong agreement of the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of France and also Italy. And of course, later the declaration became endorsed at the San Remo Conference in 1920 and became enshrined in international law. But as well as being proud, I'm also deeply ashamed of the actions of my country, because they did make that statement, they did make that declaration, but they then failed, utterly failed, miserably failed, and shamefully failed to honour it. And we went through subsequent years when the British slowly backtracked from the Balfour Declaration, leading eventually to the 1939 White Paper, in which they completely reneged on it. And they reneged on it and they restricted Jewish immigration into the land of Palestine at the very time when so many thousands upon thousands of Jews were desperate to save their own lives getting out of Europe, and they weren't allowed in because the gates were closed by Great Britain, the country that had undertaken to provide a Jewish national homeland in Palestine. Because of that, I would argue millions of Jews lost their lives. Millions lost their lives because they could not take refuge in Palestine. And that blood is on the hands not only of the Nazis who killed them, but also of the British who denied them entry. And so I think, in some ways, President Abbas is right when he says we should apologize for the Balfour Declaration, but the apology should be because we did not carry it out fully when we should have done. And not only did we fail to allow the Jews to escape from the Third Reich in 1939, but then even after the war, we prevented them coming into Palestine. And I was in Haifa a couple of weeks ago, and I met a man who, at the time, was a boy who was on the Exodus. And the Exodus, for those who don't know the story, started off in France, full of Auschwitz survivors and some others, but mainly Auschwitz survivors, went from France and attempted to get into Palestine, was intercepted and rammed by the Royal Navy, almost sunk. The passengers were taken off, and rather than send them to Cyprus, where most of the refugees that were intercepted were going to, out of spite, the British decided to make an example and send them back to France. So they got put on a number of other ships and taken back to France, where they refused to get off. And so instead of any other alternative which could have been done, again, out of spite, the British foreign secretary ordered that they be taken, these Auschwitz survivors, to Germany. To Germany. And the man I spoke to, who was a boy at the time, not only went to Germany, to Hamburg, where he was offloaded, but the British Army took him to Belsen, and they imprisoned him in Belsen, an Auschwitz survivor. Quite incredible. And so, you know, Britain has had, I think it's got a lot, should take a lot of credit for the creation of the State of Israel, but also has a lot to answer for about its treatment of Jews and the State of Israel since then. Although today the relationship is extremely good, but we still see the same effect that we saw at that time in some circumstances. And the effect, the reason this happened, the whole reason all of this happened, was due to one word: appeasement. Appeasement of the Arabs, who made it very clear from the outset of and before the Balfour Declaration they were attacking Jews in Palestine, and certainly afterwards they were. They made it very clear they weren't happy with this at all, and the British therefore decided to renege and go back on the declaration, mainly because of the attitude of the Arabs. And that same attitude of appeasement does persist today, not just from Britain, but from many European countries. And the appeasement today is not simply towards the Arabs in the Middle East, it's also towards the Muslim communities in Europe. Certainly in Britain and in other European countries, the Muslim communities are gaining electoral traction. Almost every Muslim, and you may disagree with me here, but I've certainly never met a Muslim, or I've met, shall we say, very few Muslims, who don't despise Israel. It's bred into them from birth. They're taught to hate Israel. Most of them don't know where Israel is or anything about it, but they hate it. And therefore, appeasement again. British politicians of all parties feel that if they say bad things or do bad things towards Israel, it will get votes. And not only votes, it's also, perhaps in some cases even more, about being nice to them so they won't blow us up. This is appeasement. It's what appeasement's all about. And that's why Israel suffers as a consequence of it. Not only has our appeasement of Arabs and Muslims in our own countries, not only has that caused suffering for Israel, but it's also incited violence. It's incited Palestinians and other Arabs to carry out attacks against Israel. And I'll just give you an example of what I mean. When we've had three Gaza wars, and I was in Israel for all three of them, 3 Gaza wars in recent years. And every time those wars have been caused by Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and other groups in Gaza firing missiles into Israel to the extent that they have to be resisted, they have to be confronted. Israel can't simply take it. Even if it's not killing too many people, which sovereign country can just stand by and let another country next to it, which effectively what Gaza is, send rockets into it? Holland would not do that. We would not do that. And in fact, last time it happened, it was done by the Germans in 1944, and we certainly bombarded the hell out of the rockets that were coming towards us. So that's been the case. And in every single case, European leaders, American leaders in some cases, the United Nations, other NGOs, other human rights organizations, have condemned Israel for disproportionate response, falsely condemned Israel for disproportionate response. And what the tactic of these groups that are sending rockets into Israel is not, they don't think they can defeat Israel. They don't think they can even kill that many Israelis. They know they can't. They certainly know they can't defeat Israel. When the State of Israel was created, 5 Arab armies en masse invaded, one of which was led by a British general, by the way, a serving British general, invaded the newly formed state. And since then, they were invaded and invaded and invaded, and terrorist attacks have taken place. They know they can't defeat it. So why are they doing it? They're doing it for one reason. These rockets are intended to provoke Israel to retaliate and kill their own, i.e. the Palestinian civilians. That's the purpose. They're the first people in history who have wanted their own civilians to be killed. Their army is trying to kill their own civilians, not protect it. It's incredible. And so when we say, oh yeah, Israel doesn't show enough restraint, Israel is being disproportionate, when we say that, that's what they want. They want the isolation of Israel, and and therefore, when they hear these words from David Cameron in London or from Barack Obama in Washington, what's the response? They do more of it. More people get killed. We're playing into their hands. Similarly, we're playing into their hands when we put pressure on Israel for a two-state solution. Again, it's appeasement. We know there will be no two-state solution. We know there cannot be a two-state solution. History shows us it can't happen. Why can't it happen? For one reason, the Palestinians don't want it. They're not interested in a two-state solution. The Palestinians, the leadership, when I say the Palestinians, I don't mean every Palestinian, because of course many of them simply want to wash their car or take the baby for a walk or whatever it is. But the Palestinian leadership do not want their own state. They've had plenty of chances to have their own state, and they've rejected it every time. What they want, all they want, is the annihilation of the Jewish state. That is all they want. And they will never come to terms over a two-state solution. Never. It's a possibility there might be some progress towards it occasionally, and we've seen that in the past, but it's never anything other than tactical maneuvering. It's never going to be. They can't do it. They can't do it. Do you remember Arafat, when he was asked why he didn't sign the peace agreement with the Israelis? He said, because I don't want to be taking tea with, what's his name? Who was the Egyptian president that got assassinated? Sadat. I don't want to be taking tea with Sadat. In other words, he doesn't want to join him in where Sadat's probably up there, but I think Arafat might go down there. So that's one reason there can't be a two-state solution. The other reason there can't be a two-state solution is because the IDF can never leave Judea and Samaria. They can never leave it. How can they leave it? Look at the Middle East. Look what's happening around the Middle East. Does anyone think Israel would be able to allow another Islamic state to occur right on its doorstep? It's already got enough problems with Gaza. Having Judea and Samaria as an enemy entity with the capability of attacking Israel, it would be ridiculous. Who could possibly suggest that? There was a plan produced by a general called General John Allen, who produced the Allen Plan, by coincidence. And the Allen Plan, I can tell you, I won't go into detail now because we haven't got a huge amount of time, but I can tell you, I could take it to pieces word by word. The Allen Plan, if he'd been asked to produce a defense plan to defend his own country, the United States of America, and he'd come up with that, he'd have been fired. In fact, he wouldn't have come up with it in the first place, but it's okay because it's Israel. But they can't leave it. If they leave it, let's say for the sake of argument that the Palestinians do genuinely want a peace with Israel and want their own state, and they do go along with it. Let's say that. How long is it going to last? Before Iran changes the equation, before the Islamic State or something similar moves in, before other militias move in and use it as a base to attack Israel. Even if the Palestinian, even if Fatah or, even if Hamas reformed themselves in some way, which is not going to happen in either case, but if it did, then they're going to be taken over. They're going to be overcome. And Israel can't possibly allow that. If Israel moved the IDF out of the West Bank, it would be committing suicide. So it can't do that. So there can be no independent sovereign state in the West Bank, even if the Palestinians wanted it. So no two-state solution, I'm sorry to say, ladies and gentlemen. Up in the north, and you've heard about it this morning from Matthew Levitt, I believe, so I'm not going to dwell too much on Hezbollah. Again, I can tell you a lot about Hezbollah, but I don't want to, because you've had it. But it is such a massive threat. And again, we are not helping. We are, with the United States in particular, because of course they're the main movers, are failing to recognize the real situation in Lebanon, the real threat that exists from both Hezbollah and the Lebanese armed forces, which are seamlessly joined to Hezbollah. And you know, we've seen, and yet you know, some countries, I think certainly the United States, I think Britain as well, is providing support to the Lebanese armed forces. What we should all understand is, and it may be that Matthew mentioned it this morning, what we should understand is that when, at any time there could be an outbreak of war between Hezbollah in Lebanon and Israel, 100,000 missiles plus waiting to be fired at Israel. And when that happens, what is Israel's response going to be? It's got no choice. It's going to have to be immediate and devastating. The death rate, the civilian death rate in Gaza will be nothing compared to what the Israelis will have to inflict on southern Lebanon. They will have to do it. They don't want to do it, I can assure you. I've discussed it with many generals, politicians in Israel. It's the last thing they want to do. Of course it is. Who would want to obliterate whole civilian communities? But they're going to have to. Because if they don't, Israel will get hammered by these missiles. Very sophisticated, long-range, high-powered, accurate missiles. Israel does not have the missile defense capability to intercept them all, or even the majority of them. So it will have to smash the hell out of the villages where they're all positioned. And when that happens, we really do need to make sure we don't condemn Israel for it. And if anyone here is in a position to influence politicians in this country, may I suggest that you prepare them for this eventuality and try and get them on our side on this so that they don't just condemn Israel out of hand. And in fact, what I would like to see, and I know I'm never going to see it, but what I'd like to see is when Israel sends its warplanes in, to have NATO warplanes flying in beside it. Because Hezbollah is not just a threat to Israel, as you all know, it's a threat to the world, as is its masters, Iran. And let's not forget, Hezbollah came into being in 1983, and its first major act was to kill 241 Americans and 58 French peacekeepers in 2 suicide bombings in one day. During the Iraq and Afghanistan campaign, Hezbollah killed over 1,000 American soldiers. Hezbollah, together with the IRGC and other militias that Hezbollah was arming, equipping and training on Iran's behalf. They killed over 1,000 American soldiers and a few hundred British soldiers as well, in Iraq mainly, some in Afghanistan. So they're not just a threat to Israel, they're a threat to the world and to us as well. Just checking what the time is. I don't want to overstay my welcome. I do love the sound of my own voice. Just staying briefly on the subject of Iran. Iran is the greatest threat to peace in the world today. Absolutely the greatest threat to peace. And it's been facilitated and enabled and encouraged and emboldened by President Obama and the P5+1 nuclear agreement, which not only paved the way, for nuclear weapons. Yeah, it's not in President Obama's time, and it's not in any of the other leaders of the P5+1 countries' time, because politicians, and I recognize there are politicians in this room, and I'm not accusing all politicians of this, but many politicians don't really see much beyond their sort of period of office. I'm talking particularly about leaders. And it's going to be outside that time frame, but outside that time frame, sure enough, if the deal remains in place, legally, lawfully, according to the terms of the deal, Iran will have nuclear weapons. We don't want a nuclear-armed Iran. It's going to have to be dealt with. And which country is going to deal with it? It's Israel. Maybe the United States, depending on who the leader is when the decision has to be taken. But Israel will have to deal with it, as Israel dealt with the nuclear programs of both Syria and Iraq. And if Israel hadn't dealt with the Iraqi nuclear program in 1981, then it would have been very difficult for us to have launched an operation to retake Kuwait when it was invaded by Iraq in 1990. Very difficult, because they would have been a nuclear-armed country, or could have been. And the same goes for Israel's operation in 2007 against the Syrian nuclear reactor. Can you imagine what would be the situation today if Syria had nuclear weapons? And that's why Israel acted. Israel was condemned when it acted in both cases. And then subsequently the world suddenly saw the light, and there were sort of quiet apologies, and people are grateful, but quietly grateful. They will have to go and do the same thing in the case of Iran, because it cannot be allowed to have nuclear weapons. There are other ways apart from direct military strikes, but ultimately there may have to be, I think, if the other methods that can be used don't work to delay or prevent Iranian nuclear program, Israel's going to have to go in and deal with it, I think. The recent events that we've seen in Israel and in the United States of America remind us of the threat that we all face today. And in Israel, only this morning there was an attempted stabbing attack in Hebron. We saw, a few days ago, we saw the very successful Israeli operation to destroy a terror tunnel which was burrowed under the border of Israel in order to kill Jews while they slept. And then in New York, fortunately, they intended to kill Jews while they slept, but fortunately, it was the Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas who were killed by the IDF, thank goodness. And then in New York, we saw, just a few days ago as well, we saw that terrible vehicle ramming incident. And these things, we've seen them in England, we've seen them in other countries. These things remind us of this threat that we all face. And one thing that we can be certain of is that if it wasn't for the work of our intelligence services, our national intelligence services, there will be many, many more attacks, because there are too many anyway, but probably 10 times, 20 times as many are planned and intended and stopped by intelligence, by our national intelligence services. I worked in intelligence myself for about 5 years on this very subject, and I dealt closely with, including your own intelligence services from Europe and around the world. And it's that cooperation that is vital to keeping us as safe as we can be at present. The one country, I would say, that is probably the most valuable to us all in this context is Israel. The intelligence that they provide to us saved not only our soldiers' lives when they're fighting in the Middle East and elsewhere, but it also saves the lives of our civilians, because they've got unrivaled intelligence access into Syria and Iraq and other countries where many of these fighters are planning operations, directing operations, or actually coming from, moving to and from, and so they can alert our security organizations to what's happening. So without Israel, we would be in very serious trouble indeed. But it's not just intelligence. Israel also supplies technology, including stuff to stop bombs going off. It includes battlefield medical technology, which has saved the lives of many soldiers who have fought in Afghanistan and Iraq. And they share their knowledge. They've become tragically expert at dealing with these situations, and they share their knowledge. I was in Washington and New York over the last few days with an Israeli police general who was going to visit the NYPD and various other police forces and policymakers to share his knowledge and share his expertise with them. And this is something that happens constantly. I sometimes wonder how the Israelis actually get any policing done, because they seem always to have delegations visiting them, or they're sending people over to tell others how to do it. So they're so important to us in this context. And another way they're important to us is because the role that Israel plays in keeping afloat Jordan and Egypt is incredible. Both Jordan and Egypt are in the crosshairs of the Islamic State, and in particular Jordan is in the crosshairs of Iran. And if it wasn't for Israel, I think there's every possibility that by now Jordan certainly, and possibly Egypt, would have been would have had some very, very severe pressure placed upon them and could well have collapsed or partially collapsed. And that would in turn have resulted in something that could still happen, a massive influx of refugees from the Eastern Mediterranean, which we haven't had so far. We've had enough of a refugee problem already, but without Israel there to prop up these countries on its flanks, we would have had a lot worse. So I think I've spoken about some of the ways in which Israel is strategically important to the West. The West does not recognize that normally, or not publicly, shall we say. I mean, I know that heads of state and those people directly involved in the action do recognize it, but they don't often talk about it. In fact, David Cameron, when he spoke at the Knesset a couple of years back, he did give credit to the Israelis for that assistance, but normally it's kept, people don't want to talk about it because it comes back to this whole business of appeasement, but it's so important to us. The struggle against international jihad is the greatest threat that we face in the world today. I'm not just talking about Sunni jihadism, I'm talking about Iran, Shia jihadism from Iran as well. And it's something that we are not properly focused on. We are at war. We are at war. They recognize they're at war with us. We pretend we're not at war with them, but we are at war with them. And the one effective international alliance that should be devoting its energies to combating international jihadism is not, and that's NATO. President Trump mentioned when he took office and before he took office that he wanted to reform NATO because it was basically a dead duck, and he was right. It does need reform. It needs greater contributions from the countries concerned, and it needs to be refocused and realigned. And the focus should be on, very firmly, on combating international jihadism, because it's going to engulf us all if we don't. And my view is it's also time for another Balfour Declaration. The previous Balfour Declaration, I don't quite know what Lord Turnberg said in his presentation, but the previous Balfour Declaration in many ways was an acknowledgement of the strategic value of the Jews and the land of Palestine to the West at a time when we were fighting for our lives in Europe. And it was strategically important the Balfour Declaration occurred. It wasn't all just the good old Brits being nice to the Jews. It wasn't all just that. Obviously, that was part of it. But it was strategic. It was all about strategy. And for the reasons I've outlined and many more, Israel is strategically vital for us today. So the new Balfour Declaration should recognize the strategic importance of Israel. It should bring Israel in as a full member of a reorganized NATO, because that not only would be beneficial to us on a military and on a strategic basis, but it will also help undermine this horrific, pernicious attack that takes place constantly against the state of Israel. Everywhere you look, all around the world, Israel's under fire. By the way, it's not making much difference in the big picture. And I think I saw on Twitter today, Prime Minister Netanyahu tweeted that this year they'd had the best ever tourist season that Israel's ever had. So all of this, I mean, I have no concerns about the future of the state of Israel in terms of its survival. Absolutely none. I'm absolutely confident. We've seen what Israel can do. I'm absolutely confident. But it's our responsibility, I think, as people who are on the same side. They're on the same side as us. We're Democrats. We're all Westerners. We share the same values. It's our responsibility to back them up and support them. And I think one way of doing that is the new Balfour Declaration, which brings them in to NATO. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for listening.